Well, welcome everybody. This is Kate Simonen from the Carbon Leadership Forum. We're going to wait a minute or so and then get started. So thank you all for coming. Okay, welcome. So my name is Kate Simonen, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington, director of the Carbon Leadership Forum, and one of the Embodied Carbon Network co-chairs. So my role here is to welcome you today to the first webinar of the Embodied Carbon Network in 2018, and I'm going to moderate the session moving forward. So we're excited to bring you a group of experts together speaking, and they're sharing their perspectives here with you. So these are individual perspectives that we're sharing around policy. And today, this is the first of 8 online sessions that the Embodied Carbon Network will be organizing, approximately one a month throughout the year. These will be put together from each of the different Embodied Carbon Network task forces, assembling subject matter experts, and we're arranging them to be able to get continuing education credits for the AIA. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of the Carbon Leadership Forum. The Carbon Leadership Forum sponsors have enabled us to convene the Embodied Carbon Network, so they're providing the financial support for the platforms and the webinar and the staff time of moving forward. So really appreciate their support and leadership. As most of you know, the Embodied Carbon Network is really a individual people-driven effort to advance our understanding of embodied carbon. We have opportunities for research, resource sharing through Basecamp, and action through the individual task forces. We have over 200 members globally dispersed, and we've gotten some really great international collaborations. And just last week, we're talking about bringing a Spanish language group into the fold so we can go down south and Central America. So today, we're going to have 4 different speakers. We're going to start with Amy Hatton, who's going to present the role of local policy to mitigate climate change, following up by Jordan Palmieri from Oregon DEQ, who's going to talk about current embodied carbon policies and opportunities. And Ed Midster from Design Avenues will talk about the embodied carbon of tall buildings. And in conclusion, Tina DeLegge from the Carbon Leadership Forum will be talking about recent activities around the Buy Clean Washington Act. So I want to pass over to Amy. Before on a logistics point of view, we expect this presentation to take about an hour, and then we will open up for some questions at the end of the so we have about 15 minutes for some questions. If you have questions during the presentations, please type them in through the webinar platform, and then I will compile those and ask some questions at the end. So I'm really pleased to introduce Amy Hatton. She is the Vice President of Corporate Sustainability at Thornton Tomasetti, a global structural engineering and et cetera firm. She is on the board of the Carbon Leadership Forum and is chair of the Embodied Carbon Network Policy Task Force. She has worked with the Carbon Leadership Forum, the USGBC, and Ceres to establish a building industry climate declaration. Amy, passing it to you.
Thanks, Kate. So as the Policy Task Force Chair, I just thought I would very quickly talk about the Policy Task Force so that you know about it and in case you would like to join us. The Policy Task Force has met a couple of times. We have 27 members, and through our meetings we have come up with some goals. By no means are these all the goals, just some really ideas for the group. And we have some more encompassing goals that include exchanging resources and ideas, and also learning about, following, and advocating for embodied carbon policies. And then we have some more specific ideas for what we can do together as a task force, and one was to educate policymakers through creating a fact sheet and framework around embodied carbon policies. Another was that we share the lessons learned from the Buy Clean Act so that we can help see other states have Buy Clean Acts. And lastly, to push green building certification programs further so that they have more focus on embodied carbon. We've also discussed several topics through the task force. One of the topics we've talked about some is the recent publication of Forestry Innovation Investments International Policy Review, Embodied Carbon of Buildings and Infrastructure, which is a really nice document describing the known embodied carbon policies that are out there. And we've also talked about the Buy Clean Act in California and the effort in Washington. We talk about presentations by members on embodied carbon policy, such as at Greenbuild and for the West Coast Climate Forum. And most recently, it has not yet been discussed in the task force, so this is coming soon, but Kate and I are trying to put together a draft support letter for an appeal that's come from architects to the USGBC, asking that LEED be more focused on climate change and also with more focus on embodied carbon. So that will be coming soon. So what we are trying to accomplish through our interest in embodied carbon policy is obviously to mitigate climate change. But what motivates U.S. policymakers to mitigate climate change when there's a lack of leadership at the federal level? And how could climate action at the local level inform efforts toward federal climate policy? These are the questions I asked myself back in 2008, and unfortunately, I think they're still relevant today. And so I'm dusting off my thesis from the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm sharing it with you because I think it is relevant to our discussions today. We often have an uphill battle trying to get climate policies established because climate change is a predictable surprise, as coined by Bazerman and Watkins in their 2004 paper, Predictable Surprises, the Disasters You Should Have Seen Coming, and How to Prevent Them. So a predictable surprise has two components. One, decision makers are aware of their approaching problem, and they know that action is required to stop it from getting worse. So I think we could say climate change certainly fits in that category. And then these authors said, why do they fail to respond in a timely manner while the problem's getting worse? They say it's because the response involves high short-term costs, although there are long-term benefits. And as we know, policymakers are very much focused on the short term and getting reelected. Also, while these problems get worse, economic systems tend to be operating effectively, and therefore there's no economic crisis creating change. And lastly, powerful minorities are benefiting from the status quo and are therefore trying to keep the status quo as it is. Despite this predictable surprise, there actually has been political action to mitigate climate change among cities and states, which is also where we're seeing early embodied carbon policies in the U.S. So to understand what motivates municipalities, I spoke with city mayors, city government staff, ICLEI, which is the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, and I read earlier studies and also theories of decision-making under uncertainty. And I compared these theories with the actual practice of early action to try to figure out what was going on. There are 4 indicators of early political action of climate change that are supported by both theory and experience. The strongest indicator that I found in my research is that municipal leaders perceive that co-benefits will come from these actions. Co-benefits offer results more immediately, and they help to solve problems on the political agenda, which tends to have a short-term focus. Mayor Doug Palmer of Trenton, New Jersey, he was a signatory of the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, saw that city problems like seniors living on fixed incomes and struggling to pay energy bills and high energy costs from inefficient municipal buildings could benefit from energy efficiency measures. He said, you know, in Trenton, we can't decide to reduce our emissions because of the polar bears. We had to sell this to the boys in the hood. In addition to co-benefits, we also see issue champions from within the government taking advantage of open windows for policy change. In Trenton, Mayor Palmer was the issue champion who says that he is enlightened after previously thinking climate change was a good thing because it meant less snow plowing costs. In Seattle, another city that was moving forward, it was Mayor Nichols who describes a focusing event that instigated him to take action. Mayor Nichols was the mayor who started the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, and Seattle pledged to meet the Kyoto Protocol. While not as strong an indicator as the others, internal and external shocks that provide vivid examples of the local impacts of climate change appear important in motivating action. For Mayor Nichols, his focusing event was the record low snowfall in the Cascade Mountains in 2005. No snowfall meant little water and power for the city because of the dependence on hydropower. The staff at ICLEI told me about climate change policies in Homer, Alaska, where they had experienced a bark beetle epidemic, and also in Keene, New Hampshire, where they were impacted by major floods. And lastly, political will for environmental policies among constituents seems to have an influence, but this indicator is not always present. Advocacy by citizens is not indicated as an important instigator of policy action on climate change. It actually seems more critical for policy entrepreneurs within the government to instigate a top-down approach. In Boston, the city pledged to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. When I was writing this paper, they were increasing renewables for city electricity and improving the energy efficiency of municipal buildings, and also doing a lot of other things at that time. Also, at the same time, the city public was advocating for the government to speed up its efforts to reduce fossil fuel use in certain neighborhoods. Despite this public cry, the city staff say that the attention to climate action was really brought on by several events that got Mayor Menino's attention. One of these events just seems very small, but it was important. It was when Mayor Menino was on a tour of Boston's first green building, during which a child who was also on the tour said that the building helped him to breathe easier, and that really had an impact on the mayor. Mayor Menino also saw energy efficiency and renewables as an opportunity for economic development. Surprisingly, scientific and technical information only seems to alter secondary beliefs and was not a major factor instigating action in any of the cities studied by myself and by others, such as Michelle Betzel, who wrote a paper on localizing global climate change. This is also supported by Sabatier and Wiebel in their studies of the Advocacy Coalition framework. So the recommendations from the study, which I think help us as we try to affect embodied carbon policy, include first, to help decision makers to see where there are co-benefits from policies to reduce emissions. Give decision makers best practices, have them hear from other leaders like them who have taken action, and I help them to identify items on the city agenda that would receive co-benefits. Number two is frame actions to mitigate climate change in terminology that city leaders recognize as within their field of shorter-term responsibility. One example of this kind of terminology is using risk management instead of climate mitigation. Familiar time-tested solutions may have more resonance with leaders than new solutions. So an example when we're looking at operating energy is insulating buildings, maybe more resonant than new solutions. And lastly, focus less on building awareness with the public, which was sort of a new idea for me, and focus more on identifying potential policy entrepreneurs within the government who can be change agents. So now that I've provided a little bit of a framework, I'm going to hand this over to Jordan, who could tell us about where we're already seeing embodied carbon policies and where that early action is taking place.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to introduce Jordan now. Jordan Palmieri is a senior policy analyst in the materials management program at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. There, he coordinates projects around the built environment, life cycle assessment, and purchasing. He's worked on building and zoning codes, rating systems, and served as a technical and policy expert for small housing initiatives. He recently finished a 2-year term on the U.S. Green Building Council's Material and Resources Technology Advisory Group, and is now leading a program to help Oregon concrete producers develop environmental product declarations, or EPDs. Jordan holds an MS in environmental science from Tulane University. Jordan, welcome.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Kate, and thank you as well, Amy, for kind of framing the scene here. I'm going to assume that you can all hear me okay and can see my slides, unless I hear from someone otherwise. So today I'm going to cover two things. We're going to talk about existing policies for embodied carbon, and then talk about policy opportunities moving forward. Now, I'm really only covering a selection of topics today, and definitely welcome your comments and discussion after the webinar. I know there's many experts on the line, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing other people's input and on the topic. We're going to start today talking about environmental product declarations used in policy. There's a lot going on in this arena right now, so let's jump into it. As many of you know, EPDs are third-party verified declarations for a selection of environmental impacts, generally resulting from producing materials and products. This usually is covering raw material extraction, transportation, and manufacturing. Usually it's called cradle to gate when it comes to construction materials. Now, there's plenty of EPDs in the building industry, mostly dominated by industry average EPDs, but we're seeing more and more product-specific EPDs on the market. And governments now are starting to use these EPDs to help them purchase lower impact products. Now, the Buy Clean California Act was signed by California Governor Brown about 5 months ago and is already starting to radically change purchasing policy in California. The law requires that all state purchases of certain materials have facility-specific EPDs with a global warming potential below a state set maximum. Now, California needs to set that maximum global warming potential for each material by January 1st, 2019, so that's less than a year away. And then they're going to start requiring EPDs on all state projects by July of 2019. And when we say all state projects, we're talking transportation, infrastructure, buildings, universities, state buildings. It's pretty universal. The eligible materials in the law that was passed includes mineral wool, flat glass, structural steel, and rebar. Now, from what I've been able to learn so far in just the last 4 months, California is really handling this thoughtfully and working collaboratively with the industries to have a meaningful program that goes really beyond just asking for an EPD. But it goes a step further and actually uses that EPD to buy lower impact products, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all after, right? That's why we're using these things as a purchasing tool. And although I'm presenting this as an existing policy, I also want to highlight that it is a future opportunity. This work will really set the stage for how we use EPDs in government purchasing policy nationally. So please do get involved with the public process if you're interested. The Department of General Services has a pretty good website that they've started for the Buy Clean California Act, so go check it out. The Buy Clean Washington Act is something we'll be talking about a little bit more later, so I won't go into too much depth right now. I'll just say that it was very similar to the Buy Clean California Act. It was turned into a study bill a couple of weeks ago, and then unfortunately did not pass out of committee during the last week. And so although it didn't pass this time around, we may see that type of legislation come back in Washington in 2019. In Oregon, we also had a Buy Clean Oregon Act in 2017 that didn't pass. Our bill focused on concrete, asphalt, and steel in state Department of Transportation purchases. So it specifically focused on infrastructure and transportation, not necessarily vertical buildings. We may also certainly see similar legislation coming back in the 2019 session. So the idea of us learning from what is happening in California and working collaboratively as a region is very appealing to me. One way we're helping to prepare for this potential upcoming legislation in 2019 is by helping the industry get EPDs for certain projects. For certain products. Now, in particular, at DEQ, we're focusing on concrete. Oregon's concrete EPD program provides free access to a web-based EPD tool developed by the Portland Cement Association. We provide limited technical assistance and also provide a reimbursement of about $2,500 per plant for every third-party verified EPDs that are published. Now, we run this entirely as a voluntary program. And I do want to say, despite all the buzz around EPDs, these are not a silver bullet. It's important to recognize some of the limitations. And so on the next slide, I'll briefly touch on some of the limitations that we should all be thinking about moving forward. And although I really do love EPDs and I do own a t-shirt that looks like this one, there are challenges. Some of them have to do with things like life cycle stages, transport to the site. This is stage A4 in LCA world, and most construction EPDs for products do not take into account the impacts of transporting from the manufacturer's gate to the construction site. So, how does a product sourced from 5,000 miles away compare to the product sourced from 20 miles away if you're only taking into account manufacturing impacts and not transport? We've been hearing that. Another one is cost to small businesses. EPDs used to be very expensive for individual companies to pursue. With the advent of more tools on the market that are starting to standardize the way EPDs are done for certain product categories, I think the cost of entry is lower, but still this could be a barrier for small manufacturers in various states. Talk briefly about data uncertainty. When we're setting thresholds and we sort of draw a line in the sand, we need to be pretty confident that the results that we're calculating are accurate. And right now, when we look at EPD results, they're really not characterized with any sort of uncertainty. There's no plus or minus 10% or error bars around your final value. And so when we do draw a line in the sand, we have to really think about how data uncertainty plays into that decision. Another issue is around supply chains. For most building products, the manufacturing stage A3 is not where the majority of the impacts are. Most of the impacts are in sourcing your raw materials and producing those raw materials. So there's been some concern that there's sort of undue burden on the manufacturers when maybe we should be putting a little bit more pressure on the raw material suppliers themselves. Another issue is about foreign products. Not only are many foreign products entering our marketplace without any life cycle information at all. But some are entering with EPDs, but they're EPDs from other countries that use different accounting rules to calculate the impact. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to deal with that, because there are different rules around the world, and we are an international economy. So that's about foreign products. And then finally, about how EPDs will be used. When we start thinking about these thresholds that we might be setting, one thing I've observed in the concrete world is that I find that it's less often that concrete EPDs are being used to distinguish between company A and company B, but it's more often that once someone chooses let's say a concrete subcontractor, the EPDs are used to help choose lower impact mixes within the actual project. And so we need to be thinking about how EPDs for different products are used. It's not always a comparison from one business to another. Sometimes it's just a comparison within a business of how to get a lower impact product from that same manufacturer. All right, now I'm going to talk about LEED v4, because LEED v4 is a green building rating system that directly acts as government policy when there's a requirement to the LEED standard. Here are states that had LEED standards or local governments that drove policy. The state of Washington has a requirement to build to LEED Silver, and it was that requirement that drove their project team to pursue and achieve some of the new LEED v4 credits for EPDs. Now, on this project, the architect was DGF, the general contractor was Deconstruction. The project required that product-specific EPDs be submitted for bid, and this drove at least one Washington-based concrete producer to specifically go out and get EPDs to be able to bid on this project. Now, in turn, this kind of produced this cascading effect in the Seattle area, which then many other producers followed suit and went out and got EPDs to be competitive on projects. Now, what's really impressive to me about this project in particular in Olympia is that they actually used the EPDs to select lower impact mixes for different parts of the building. They were able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by just over 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is equivalent to approximately taking 240 passenger vehicles off the road for 1 year. Now, in talking with Dave Walsh from Deconstruction, he said, one of the main lessons learned on this project was to use low cement mixes in places that don't need that early strength. Places like column footings and mat slabs. Many of us probably on the call are aware that low cement mixes take longer to achieve their final strength and really have the potential to disrupt the project schedule if used in certain locations that really need high early strength, like post-tension slabs. Another project I want to highlight is the new Multnomah County Courthouse being constructed in downtown Portland. Let's see, Multnomah County has a requirement to build to LEED Gold, which really drove the project teams to pursue the EPD credits. Cal Portland agreed to get product-specific EPDs for their concrete products on this project, and I'm currently working with them to help get their first round of EPDs verified for their Oregon-based plants. Next, I want to talk a little bit about a few material reuse policies that also conserve environment. About a year ago, the city of Portland passed the first residential deconstruction requirement in the country. The ordinance requires that any home built before 1917 is required to be deconstructed. Now, the primary policy drivers for this ordinance were job creation, material salvage, and lead and asbestos hazard mitigation. There's been about 100 homes that have gone through the program over the last year, and we at DEQ are now conducting an analysis of the carbon and energy benefits of the first 40 homes that have gone through the program. That report should be ready in a few months. Now, the nice thing about this policy that I really like is that it was really pitched as a policy about sustainability. It touched on social, economic, and environmental goals, and they all played a role. While embodied carbon was certainly discussed in the policy development, it definitely wasn't the main leading driver. So one lesson learned here is that not every embodied carbon policy, needs to be pitched as an embodied carbon policy. And this kind of speaks to some of the things Amy was talking about in the intro, is that we need to find co-benefits for these policies. We need to be talking about these types of policies in different terms, and think about what really sells these. Is it the jobs or is it the carbon? So something to think about moving forward. Another policy change that happened last year was when building code in Oregon was updated to allow the reuse of salvaged structural lumber. If you got this big program producing a whole bunch of new salvage material, that program's only really going to be effective as far as environmentally if people are actually using those materials and it's displacing the production of new lumber. And so the new code removed the requirement to get approval by the building inspector, and it even waived the requirement to regrade the lumber as long as it didn't have any signs of rot or decay. Now, this same exact proposal was recently submitted to our commercial building code update process, so we're waiting to see what will happen with that in commercial code. Next, I'm going to shift gears for a few minutes and talk about whole building policies. Governor Kate Brown of Oregon recently signed an executive order to address the built environment's climate impacts. Now, while most of this bill is focused on operational efficiency, we were able to include an evaluation of embodied carbon impacts during the construction of new state buildings in 2022 and beyond. And so while we still have a few years to get ready for it, we are very excited about the opportunity to have this influence on the construction of new state buildings. And one model we're looking at and considering in our own way to address this issue is what's happening right now in the state of Minnesota with their B3 guidelines. As of July 2017, Minnesota requires a whole building LCA for all new state buildings and renovations. One thing I like about the policy is that it's not just a one path to compliance. They provide 3 different paths because all projects are different, right? They provide a material substitution, a building assembly path, and then also a whole building LCA path. So we definitely plan to monitor the progress of this program to see how it might fit into our goals for Oregon state buildings. Moving a little further to the north here in North America, over in Vancouver, BC, they recently passed, there's a lot going on in 2017 here. In May of 2017, they passed a policy that requires that you report the embodied emissions of materials for all rezoned buildings. Now, their initial goal of this policy is to collect better data and understand the scale of emissions throughout the city. Now, what's nice about this policy from my perspective is that it's a very easy phase-in. It only affects a small subset of the city's building community. And generally, when you think about rezoning efforts, it's really the developer that's benefiting from the rezone. They're usually able to build more units or bigger or taller or whatever the rezone is. So in this case, the city now is getting something back that's valuable for them in these rezoning projects, and it's valuable for them in their long-term planning efforts to think about how planning and zoning does affect embodied carbon within their city boundaries. I'm going to move on to a few international examples real quickly. In the Netherlands, all new buildings over 1,000 square feet are required to submit an estimate of embodied greenhouse gas emissions. Sometime in 2018, they do plan to set an upper limit for permittees. In Germany, whole building LCA is required for all new federal buildings, and they also have a private sector green building program that rewards whole building LCA as well. France has set embodied carbon targets for buildings, and they become mandatory to measure against these targets in 2020. And one thing I want to highlight about these international policies, there's not much time to talk about all of these, is that one thing that really seems common in the European examples I've highlighted is that they all have invested in national EPD databases and common and often free LCA tools and data sets for actually doing this work. So as we build up this practice in North America and in other places, we should be thinking about how this has developed in Europe and learn from some of our counterparts there, some of whom may actually be on this call. I'm not too sure. All right, I'm going to move on to policy opportunities. So let's talk about climate action plans. At the local level, in my opinion, it's all about climate action plans. These are the plans that prioritize the list of actions the city can take to reduce emissions. However, the embodied emissions of building materials is often missing from the conversation. And this is because in the past, we really haven't done a great job of measuring the embodied carbon impacts in the built environment. Fortunately, however, that has been changing over the last few years. These are the aggregated greenhouse gas emission inventories of about 40 different public institutions, including cities, states, and universities. When these institutions measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, remember scope 3 emissions are the supply chain emissions resulting from your purchasing activities, we see a very strong trend. About 55% of the emissions are from purchasing activities. So let's dig deeper in the next slide about what types of purchasing activities contribute most to these emissions. We see that all the way on the left there, construction and maintenance emissions dominate the purchasing related emissions for all institutions. These emissions are mostly due to all the materials these institutions are consuming in their buildings and in their infrastructure. So now when a city is developing their climate action plan, it's apparent to them that there's a large reduction potential in the construction sector. And that's a good thing to point out as they're developing their policies. Another opportunity I want to stress is how to combine embodied goals with operational goals. This is also something that Amy hit on. How can we dovetail policies? Many cities already require commercial and residential reporting of energy use and in some cases carbon as well. But it's all about operational right now. But we should think about how to use these policies and expand the scope into embodied carbon as well. I just want to highlight one more way that measurement can really help, and particularly in Oregon, it has helped us. Here is Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory for the year 2014. And now we can see in this inventory, materials make up over 40% of all emissions. Now, that is a lot. As we look deeper into these emission categories, we find that the consumption of building materials accounts for approximately 8% of all state emissions. Now, this is the type of information that helps us at DEQ prioritize our efforts, and it's exactly the reason why I focus my time on the built environment. Another potentially large policy opportunity I see is building code. Building code affects material use considerably, yet we've done very little to address embodied impacts of materials through code. Now, one interesting example is a current code proposal in Oregon to the Commercial Building Code Division to allow the internal conversion of large homes into 3- and 4-unit apartments. Now, the proposal is that they would like to do these conversions under the residential code instead of the commercial code. And that's because anything more than constructing of 2 units in Oregon automatically triggers the commercial code. And the code is stringent enough that it basically prohibits old, larger homes from converting into triplexes and quadplexes because of some of the sound requirements, the fire requirements, and the structural requirements. However, these projects would be much more feasible if they were done under the residential code. So you might be asking why I'm mentioning this. And because this proposal was actually pitched as an affordable housing proposal. And affordable housing is an issue that we see all across of North America as we densify our cities. And this internal conversion strategy actually creates more affordable housing and preserves the existing character and carbon of the structure. And once again, the more we're able to tie embodied carbon concepts into other policies, the more familiar people will get with the concept. And in some circles, kind of like Amy said, you shouldn't even be using the term embodied carbon. We should be using maybe material conservation or preservation, and that might resonate with people much more. I do want to quickly mention building reuse and historic preservation. These practices are rarely characterized as embodied carbon strategies, but they are definitely among the best we have. The studies I'm showing here on the slide were 2 really good studies that really highlighted and quantified the value of building reuse and historic preservation. And so that's something to consider moving forward as well. The last point I want to touch on before turning it over to Anne is that I think there's a really immense opportunity with the zoning code to address embodied carbon at the city planning scale instead of just the site scale. You know, if you think about it, we're right now kind of doing plot by plot, site by site, and it's a very piecemeal approach. But if we think about making large scale change in a short amount of time that is really needed for climate change mitigation, we need to be thinking more broadly. We need to be thinking where we build buildings, how we build buildings, how tall we build buildings, and what they're made out of. And so with that, I'm now going to wrap up and turn it over to Anne to talk more about zoning code.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was fantastic. Now I'd like to introduce Anne Edminster. She has a Master of Architecture and is an international expert on sustainable residential construction and zero net energy. She was a principal developer of Lead for Homes and authored Energy-Free Homes for a Small Planet, the award-winning guide to designing and building zero energy homes. She consults on zero energy initiatives throughout North America, served on the 2015 US DOE Solar Decathlon Juror, and is a board member and the project director of the Net Zero Energy Coalition. She collaborates with building professionals, utilities, nonprofits, supply chain clients, investors, public agencies, and homeowners to create leading edge projects and advocate for zero energy and low carbon building solutions at all scales. Anne, welcome.
Thank you, Kate. I'm delighted to be part of this presentation today and really enjoyed Amy's and Jordan's talk so far. So my subject is a little bit different. I'm kind of pulling out the lens here, and the image you're seeing here, for those of you not intimately familiar with San Francisco, this is a shot of the downtown area taken from the southeast corner of the city on Potrero Hill. And I'm a very long time resident of the Bay Area. I've been here most of my life. And in recent years, the construction of more and more tall towers like the Salesforce Tower and the Millennium Tower to its right, among many others, has really brought to the fore something that has concerned me for a long time, which is that increasing density vertically probably has a limit from a carbon perspective. And as traffic impacts are exacerbated with the increase in density in the Bay Area, all across the Bay Area, this has brought this really to the front of my consciousness where I could no longer ignore it and had to start doing some research on it. And as a result, wrote a chapter for a new book, which was recently published, called The New Carbon Architecture. So again, my premise is that, yes, I think buildings can be too tall from a carbon perspective, that certainly there are arguments in favor of density, and I don't disbelieve those, but I think that we need to be a little more critical in examining when circumstances dictate increasing density and when perhaps they dictate a limitation on that. So the primary areas that I believe need to be evaluated are transportation, operating energy, resiliency, and livability. So we need to look simultaneously through the lens of embodied carbon and these other factors. So what I'm doing today is really just running through very, very quickly the reasons I think these need to be looked at and sort of setting up a discussion. The chapter I wrote in the book really lays out the problem. It does not solve it. It certainly provides some indications, but not concrete answers. It raises more questions than it answers. So we're just starting on this journey. To set the stage for this, I think it's important to recap something that many of you, or perhaps all of you, already know, and that is that wood, concrete, and steel, of course, have been the topic of many debates for decades about embodied energy, embodied carbon, and we haven't had a tremendous amount of progress on that until recent times. but there are a couple of studies. So from Catherine DeWolf in 2017, we have the graph shown here demonstrating that the amount of material per square foot of building is considerably lower in moderately sized buildings up to about 10 stories and starts to creep up as buildings get taller. This is for structural materials, by the way. There's a lot more incredibly rich information in Catherine's work. I certainly encourage all of you to read it if you haven't. This also converges, for purposes of my discussion, however, with the fact that there is also potentially a practical limit on where wood structure buildings are most easily built. And that is, again, in this sort of low to mid-rise. Again, if we're talking code, once we're up to 4 and above, in many cases, we're talking about high-rise. But there's sort of high-rise, and then there's really tall. So cross-laminated timber is a material that is showing promise to go really, really high, and there are those who believe that there is no upper limit to the use of cross-laminated timber in high buildings. However, as we go up, there are other material implications too. For example, we are more and more reliant on electrified mechanical vertical transportation, elevators and escalators as we go up. All of those have embodied carbon impacts. So there are a whole bunch of indicators suggesting that if we really want to be moderate on a per square foot basis in terms of embodied carbon and materials, that we're looking at a somewhat low level for high-rise buildings. Secondly, transportation impacts. The arguments I hear most frequently for going vertical are, well, we need density because we won't be able to afford mass transit or justify mass transit unless we have the density. But I find some problems with this argument. First of all, I live in an area where we have good mass transit. San Francisco is second only to New York in terms of providing excellent access to jobs on mass transit for the area's residents, and yet we are also second worst in traffic impacts after Los Angeles. So there's a little cognitive dissonance in these two facts. And the other thing is we have to ask the question, does adding density reduce congestion? Well, I would contend that it doesn't, because the demand for improved transit in these areas that already have good mass transit and are already relatively dense, we won't ever catch up. There are too many impediments to the creation of mass transit. There are financial impediments, there are land ownership impediments, there are institutional impediments. So it's, in my mind, a very fallacious assumption to imagine that mass transit is ever going to meet demand and make the traffic problems go away in these areas where, again, we have density, we have good mass transit. And of course, the congestion carries with it tremendous problems with emissions. So the more people we bring into these high-rise workplaces and residences, bring emissions along with them. So now let's talk a little bit about operating energy impacts. For a long time, I think it's been held that high-density living in general represents lower carbon impacts on a, say, per-occupant basis. But there have been a couple of recent studies that challenge that. The first one I'm citing here is one that was done in Toronto by a group headed up by, I believe it's Michael O'Brien in 2010, and they showed that once you start to factor in transportation impacts, that truism is no longer necessarily a fact. So in this particular case, you can see with the lower dotted line, they showed that medium density neighborhoods dominated by townhouses actually showed the potential to have a net carbon impact of the housing solar energy, which of course is increasingly a reality in new projects, and transportation together could even be lower than high-rise. So there's another indicator there. Another study that points in the same direction was done by Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill firm, led up by one of their staff members. And in this case, they looked at several different prototypes, 8 or 9 different housing prototypes. And in each case, they said they took a hypothetical number of 2,000 units and said, we'll put this many units into these different housing types, ranging from a basic detached suburban house up to a 215-story tower, and compared various types of carbon and other impacts. And in that research project, they found that the 4-story courtyard building was both the most energy efficient and had the lowest life cycle carbon intensity. So some other interesting findings in that study, which they're ambiguous. I'm going to say I'm certainly slanting the data to present the things I think are important. Others may take other things away from these studies. So once again, I encourage you to read them. So I'm by no means trying to make the case that this is a slam dunk, but simply that needs more research. From a resiliency perspective, and this one I have hard data on. I have a couple of surveys or studies that have looked at this in a fairly squishy kind of way, but from a purely intuitive perspective, I think it's really obvious that if there's a power outage, and certainly power outages are more and more a fact of life in a world of climate-driven events, I'll call them, I would much rather be in building C than in building A or B, because A, I can probably walk to the ground floor and get out relatively easily, and B, if I'm stuck in the building, I might not roast to death because I've lost cooling. So this is another factor. And then finally, and this is the only one that doesn't have specific carbon impacts that at least that are readily grasped, but I think it's still quite important, is the experiential aspect of being in an area dominated by extremely tall buildings. And I'm sure all of you have been in these central business districts where there is deep shade at nearly all times of day, incredible wind tunnels in some areas, not just the Windy City, but other cities too, and also the sense of scale that a more pedestrian-friendly experience exists at street level in areas that are not dominated by enormous buildings. So wrapping this up to say, all right, what does this all have to do with policy? And Jordan talked about climate action plans and the fact that cities really are where it's happening for policy action. Amy also pointed to this. The climate action plans indicate, where cities have opportunities to address carbon impacts. Inevitably, those force them to look at the building sector. Yet, development economics really are pushing against us here. They do favor taller buildings in urban centers. So if we're ever going to have a hope of pushing back against those economic forces, it is really going to require us to have good, solid data indicating if and when there are limits to height that should be enacted in policy. So that's my pitch to say, I'd love to get more people involved in this research. I have a lengthy list of questions to answer and welcome anyone who wants to get in this sandbox and play with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm now going to be transitioning to Tina DeLeggi. She's the program manager for the Carbon Leadership Forum and is responsible for the communication and outreach of the Embodied Carbon Network. She has been coordinating engagement of Embodied Carbon members over the last month with the recent Buy Clean Washington policy development, and we look forward to your update on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Amy, Jordan, and Anne. Those were great presentations. I know I've learned a lot more today, and policy is such a complex and fast-moving concept with a lot of different parts, and it requires quick action and having good relationships and partnerships. And so as individuals, it can often feel a little bit difficult and overwhelming to know what you can do to inform good policy that will have a positive impact on not only the environment, but your own life and your own communities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Buy Clean Washington bill, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about the actual bill requirements and language, but I kind of just want to show that on how people can come together to become part of the policymaking process. So the Buy Clean Washington bill was very similar to the Buy Clean California Act in its goals. It was introduced in Washington by Representative Beth Dolio on January 8th, so not too long ago. And at a high level, the overall goal of the bill was that state building infrastructure projects using public dollars would need to account for the environmental impact of building materials and make decisions based on that information. So this bill came on our radar quite fast. Through the network, as many of you on the line have probably seen, we use Basecamp as a communication platform to share information with each other and engage in discussion. So this was brought to our attention through Basecamp by Dave Walsh from Selling Construction. And this sparked a lot of interest and engagement and discussion among network members, both on Basecamp and through follow-up phone calls and emails. And there was just a lot of activity and people wanting to know how they could, learn more about the bill and then actually take their knowledge and experience that they have from research and practice and feed it back to the right decision makers. So while we were having these discussions in the network, we were also thinking about, how do we actually translate what we're talking about into action and create a feedback loop between the people we're talking to from the building sector and policymakers down in Olympia. So that was our goal, and we were also taking note that a lot of people we were talking to felt that they supported the overall goal of the bill, and it was something that was definitely in alignment with the goal of the Embodied Carbon Network. But when it came to the actual draft language, there was a lot more questions than answers and a bit of concern on what the implications would be if such a bill was actually passed and what this would mean for industry in the different product markets. So just to sort of reflect back at a high level, some other things that we heard, there was a lot of concern about the eligible materials, not only what should be included, but how they should be categorized and broken down, and how ready different product markets would be to be able to report the environmental impact. And so, we had a lot of analysis on this and hearing from people, and people were giving recommendations on what they thought the material list should include. I know down in California, while a lot of people were excited that the bill was passed, there was a bit of kind of concern that some materials such as concrete weren't on the final list. And so we wanted to make sure that we got it right up here in Washington. And so sort of in parallel with these discussions, again, we were trying to take action to get on the radar of Beth Dolio and her staff. And so I ended up working with a few of you to put together a statement that essentially echoed this, that we support the goal, and we have been thinking about it. We have some of our own analysis. So we wanted to position ourselves as a resource that these decision makers could leverage as they continue to draft bill language. And so I sent this letter off and had a number of you actually sign it. And within an hour of sending it, we heard back from Representative Dolio, and she invited us to attend a stakeholder session, which Kate and I were able to attend. And it was really great to be a part of. Kate was able to give a lot of technical and scientific input that was just leveraging years of Carbon Leadership Forum experience. So it was a great intersection of seeing both research and practice kind of bridge with policy to help inform the bill. So I'm going to have to move pretty quickly as we're coming up on time. But again, through all of these conversations, there was a lot of consensus that in order for this to be a bill that we would feel comfortable about and feel that it was something that wouldn't result in undue harm, it was felt that there definitely needed to be more research to understand the environmental impact of the regulations and how feasible implementation would be, not only for building industry in different product markets, but for the actual government agency responsible for implementing it. I'm sure, as a lot of you can appreciate, this type of work involves a lot of specific skills and so forth. And so that is a lot of cost and planning and time for government to be able to get that kind of capability in-house. And so in the end, through kind of our discussions with Embodied Carbon Network members and having this feedback loop with Representative Dolio and her staff, we were able to directly shape the next version of the bill that went forth for a vote. And in this bill, there was a direct clause that said, you know, there should be a research phase to have some pilot case study projects to sample the regulations on, and then evaluate and test and collect data on how it was going, and then consult with stakeholders in the building industry to get more information and then shape something that would ultimately have a good impact. So again, you know, I wish that I was presenting today on a bill that was still very much alive, but it is, you know, I think it's really encouraging that these things are being brought to the table. So for us, there's still a lot of work to do, and I think this showed that, you know, when we come together as individuals, we can really make a difference quite quickly. And so I encourage all of you out there to go away and think about your own jurisdictions and geographies and have your ear to the ground of policy and other project-related work happening, and think about how you can be part of the process. Okay, so I am also going to wrap us up. We've had a few questions come in during this session, so we're going to take some time at the end to answer those questions with our other presenters. Just a reminder that this is the first of 8 webinars throughout the year. So our next one is in a month, and this will be hosted by the Renewable Materials Task Force. You can go ahead and register for that. If any of you on the line aren't part of the Embodied Carbon Network, I encourage you to learn more and potentially join. And a reminder too that you all can join as many task forces as you would like. Hopefully the policy task force is something that has piqued more interest today. And a reminder too that this is eligible for AIA continuing education credit. So in order to get that, email me at the email address below, and I will work with the department and AIA to get you those credits.
Thank you, Tina. Okay, so this has been really interesting and inspiring. So thank you all to the speakers. I have a couple of different questions that have come up. So first, Jordan, could you elaborate a little bit about how rezoning could actually have an embodied carbon impact? And I can't hear you yet, Jordan. So I think we need to unmute Jordan. Okay.
Got it. Am I? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So rezoning can take a lot of different forms. You know, if you had a formal industrial area and you applied for rezoning to make it high density residential, the impact of a 15-story residential building from an embodied carbon perspective is going to be way higher than a 1-story industrial warehouse that may have been there before you rezoned. So that is generally the concept of how rezoning can increase embodied impacts, and it is my guess as to why Vancouver, BC is specifically targeting these types of projects for measurement.
And so is that meaning that rezoning is like getting a variance to change the zoning for a specific project for some particular reason? So they're like trying to get an exception to zoning policies, or is it for when they're making broad scale rezoning of a neighborhood? You know?
Right. Yeah. I think I'm talking about, and I think what the Vancouver policy is on a site by site basis, where you can apply for a variance to zoning in many cities for many different types of zones, and it's generally the sort of type of example I gave you, where you're generally zoned for lower density, but the developer wants to do higher density, and sometimes in exchange for that they need to do something else. And in every city it sort of changes what you need to do to sort of in that exchange. In some cases, you need to preserve land for that use that you are sort of abandoning somewhere else in the city. Like, so you're doing really a zoning transfer. So those are some of the ideas. But yeah, I think it could apply both to the site scale and then rezoning more largely to the city scale as well.
Thank you, Amy. I found your description of policy entrepreneurs really fascinating, and I would like if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe give some examples, and maybe then and after Amy, if other people on the panel could comment of what that means to you. So Amy?
Yep, sure. Well, policy entrepreneurs really comes from sort of the theoretical research papers about how an individual can step into what's called a window of opportunity and create change. But in general, if you take it away from the academic literature, I mean, it's it's basically someone who takes the initiative to make a change, a policy change that may differ from the status quo, and that sort of they show leadership and are willing to do something that's out of the ordinary.
And so that could be a government staff person that sees how something new might happen yet still fit in with the framework of existing direction.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
I have a question for Jordan, and this is because the Buy Clean Washington bill is so fresh in our mind, and wasn't something that went forward this year. I wanted to know if you have any insight from down in Oregon in what were some of perhaps the political or just kind of the general environment of politics down in Oregon that prevented the Buy Clean Oregon bill from going forward.
Sure. I think that my general take on it is that there wasn't enough outreach done to the affected industries early enough. We were talking about concrete, asphalt, and steel. There also wasn't enough outreach done directly to the agency pegged to do these purchasing activities in the bill. I think that it was so. As we saw in the Buy Clean Washington Act, there's a lot of competing priorities in any given legislative session, and if you don't have your stakeholders lined up, and they don't know about the bill, they're not educated about the bill, and if they don't have an opinion on the bill, if they're having to do on-the-fly analysis on it, and it affects their industry, you're definitely going to have an uphill battle to getting it passed. So there needs to be significant stakeholder outreach to make these efforts successful, is what I've experienced in Oregon. And I know in the California process, it made it through the legislature, but still it sat on the governor's desk for almost 2 months. And there was a lot of speculation that it would have never been signed because, again, industry kept coming and saying, hey, there's problems with this, and here are those problems. One of the particular problems we saw in Oregon was around how they how they were going to require the EPDs be presented. You know, the bill was worded in such a way where the EPDs would be presented at the time of bid, but that's nearly impossible for many construction products because, like for asphalt producers, for instance, and in some, well, mostly asphalt producers, when they're bidding on a project, like a transportation project, they don't even know where they're going to get their aggregate source from during their bid. They don't know that until after they get the project. And so producing a product-specific EPD and submitting that at the time of bid is not possible. And so that was a flaw in the Oregon bill. Interesting to reflect that that's not a flaw in the California bill. In the California bill, they actually say that the EPD is due at the time of installation. So you are allowed to actually submit bids and go through sort of the normal bid contracting process without third-party verified EPDs in California. But by the time you install that product, you do need to have a verified EPD. So those are a couple of the reflections on policy.
Let's see. I have a question for Anne. Anne, you talked about the need for data to analyze these options. You know, different options for density and height. And I'm curious if you could reflect on how you know, what format that data should be in order to be that, quote, persuasive research that you talked about to inform decisions, you know, at the scale of the climate action plans and such. You know, for example, is it interactive tools? Is it a summary analysis report? What you know, do they need to be regionally specific analysis, or can they be generic data? Those are some of the things I'm curious about.
Sure. Great question. I think we're probably quite a ways from tools. I mean, I think that would be great. We need to get there. But in the meantime, I think that we simply need a lot more studies to understand, for example, I mean, I've got a list of 14 questions at the end of the chapter that I wrote for the new carbon architecture. What level of density will support mass transit and other low carbon transportation alternatives, supported to a degree that is sufficient to supplant personal automobile use? So, and what does good enough mean? That's in terms of providing proximity, frequency, service quality, affordability, and so forth. So that's just one of the 14 questions. So we don't have the answers to so many things. Question 2, is there height at which embodied carbon starts to increase beyond values that are consistent with cities' carbon reduction goals? We don't really know that because we don't have enough data on embodied carbon on a per square foot basis, on a per functional unit basis. Is that per functional unit per occupant of a building, for example, might be true in the case of residential. It might be some other unit for other building uses. We don't have a solid understanding of the relationship between height and density. We don't know if one or the other or both should be the focus of policy attention. Are there drivers other than building height that also significantly start to increase embodied carbon in buildings? And we also suspect, but don't necessarily know for a fact, that the specific context matters. In other words, is the answer different for a climate such as Minneapolis as compared to Houston because of different heating and cooling loads associated with building types? So there's just a whole lot more research, I think, that needs to be done before we get to anything like a tool, because we need to have a much better understanding of the relationships among all of these variables. I hope that made sense.
I think that did, and you're prompting some other questions, but we're getting close on time. I think what I would summarize what I heard you say is that when we look at planning and zoning, we need to include both operating and embodied impacts as well as transportation and land use impacts, and so that we need to expand the vision beyond the single building or simple metrics.
That's a good summary, Kate. Thank you.
And then I think I'm going to leave it at that. We are at 10:15. We have finished the first of our 8 Embodied Carbon Network webinars for the year. We hope you will join us for others. We have a large group of you here today, and I imagine we could have a really successful and exciting conversation were we all in the same room for an hour or two. So I encourage you to follow up and engage in discussion online in Basecamp. Consider joining in New York for a Build Positive session on Wednesday the 20th as part of the AIA convention. And please send along any suggestions you have and engage with your task forces to help the next webinars move forward successfully. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kate.